Alright, so in this lesson we're going to have a look at one of the fathers of classical liberalism and one of the most influential English philosophers in history, John Locke, and he lived between 1632 and 1704. So, his influence on English thought. John Locke was the father of classical liberalism, which was born during the early Enlightenment, so essentially the 1700s. He disputed the hitherto commonly believed convention that kings had a divine right to rule, as he believed citizens should not be subservient to the governing class. Instead, he proposed that the state should serve the interests of the governed, and not vice versa, an idea that Thomas Hobbes would later develop as social contract theory, and obviously it would be essentially ruined by Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, Locke and the state of nature. Locke believed that prior to the formation of the state, there was a natural society that served the interests of mankind tolerably. This idea would be later disputed by Thomas Hobbes, who perceived the state of nature to be nasty, brutish, and short, which is a strong deviation from Locke's perception of the state of nature being a largely positive thing. Locke's position on viewing the state of nature as tolerable would be used by Jean-Jacques Rousseau later in the Enlightenment to justify his view that man is born good but is corrupted by society. Obviously, this is not true. This optimistic view of human nature espoused by Locke would prove disastrous in later years, as it encouraged a form of political idealism which suggested that man could behave in a particular way based on how you condition him, which is obviously why the socialists and the more left-wing ideologues will try to essentially socially condition people, like we see in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. If you haven't read that, I'd highly recommend it. This political idealist utopia would never come into fruition, as the a priori assertion that man can behave as you condition him does not take human nature into account. Therefore, idealists try to mould man to achieve their utopia to no avail. So, like Thrasymachus, they believe that ends justify the means, which results in the slaughter of political dissidents in order to attempt to achieve an unachievable goal. It is like putting a corner jigsaw piece into the middle of the picture. It does not fit, so you must cut off the unwanted nodes with scissors. And obviously in real life, instead of scissors, it is guns, and instead of unwanted nodes, it is political dissidents. Locke's notion of tabula rasa also plays into this idea. Locke and natural rights. Locke believed the state of nature. Locke believed the state of law's legitimacy depended upon it respecting the natural rights of citizens, thus ensuring the government does not violate the social contract. Locke proposed a government that featured a separation of powers, with the judiciary, legislature, and executive each having their own branches, separate from one another. This is an idea that would be utilized by the framers of the U.S. Constitution, who clearly established a separation of powers in 1787, and introduced natural rights with the 1789 Bill of Rights, written largely by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. So, although Locke clearly influenced the US Constitution with his opinions on separation of powers, natural rights, and religious tolerance, Founding fathers such as James Madison outlined in the Federalist Papers that their ideal government should take into account that man is a mixture of virtues and vices. Madison states that if man were purely an angel, no government would be necessary, and were he purely a demon, no government could control him. This deviation from Locke's optimistic view of human nature was extremely important to the success of the American government, and it allowed Americans to avoid the bloodshed that inevitably comes from attempting to apply a political ideal to reality. So, Locke and the abolition of slavery. It is clear that Locke's empiricism was integral to the development of the scientific method. However, his tabula rasa proposition, despite its flaws, was a primary reason for the abolition of slavery, as it produced the notion that all men are created equal, and thus should be entitled to formal equality under the law. This idea would influence the British abolitionists of 1807 and the American abolitionists of the Civil War, so the 1860s. And for those of you who do not know, Locke's tabula rasa is essentially just the theory that people are born a blank slate and their personality, wants, drives, desires, achievements are all moulded from how society influences you from that point. So essentially, think of like if random people were like the protagonists in Blood Brothers. So if you switch them, they would act exactly the same given the same social conditioning. And empiricism is essentially the observation of empirical truth, so things that you can observe or sense. So, just to summarise, we'll take a look at Locke's famous works and the core ideas he espoused throughout his life. So his famous works were the two treatises of government, his letters concerning toleration, and his essays on parenting, and his core ideas were mechanistic theory, natural liberties, so essentially negative liberties there, empiricism, which I have just elaborated on, classical liberalism, which is essentially just a school of thought, one of the major political ideologies, and it's still major today, the social contract, and tolerance. So that's it for John Locke.